No, I was going to say, just continuing on then chronologically. So we have Hume, and he then really undermines the certainty of knowledge for the empirical school regarding this critique. So if you want to talk about causality, law of identity throughout space and time, these are appeals back to, as we talked about, these 10 categories of Aristotle, which you cannot justify using the empirical method. And so thereby, for Hume, if you can't use the empirical method, you can't believe in them with certainty. Now, maybe they exist, but you can't know it. And so then that leads really to Kant going in conversation with Hume, and he tries to posit, well, all these categories, these 10 foundational first principle categories of Aristotle, they're just in your mind. They're a priori categories. He has 12 that they're through the synthetic experience of your a priori categories and the phenomena, agreeing with Humean understanding that really all we know is phenomena. He's saying, okay, I agree with Hume with the phenomena. I'm anteing up mental categories, a priori categories, and that is the nature of reality. And then he tries to really at the end and working on his metaphysics, he then uses morality as his way to try to get out of this epistemological problem. His critique of pure reason is that when you critique pure reason really it becomes circular, and therefore it must just be these mental categories for understanding.
Yeah, so Kant is the next important figure. I mean, you could say Locke and Berkeley are important too in different ways, but the reason Kant is important is because he's really shaken by Hume's writings. And so he says famously that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers. Right. And so in the Prolegomena in Future Metaphysics, Kant points out that he was really kind of going to have to work hard to give an account for and justify doing metaphysics because, I mean, charitably reading Kant, right, he didn't want to give up metaphysics. Right. He wants us to be able to do it. And while, again, we can appreciate the exercise or the desire here, the system is a gigantic failure. Right. Because what Kant ends up doing is, as you said, sort of making the reason Kant's system is called transcendental idealism is because essentially everything that he wants to rescue from metaphysics, he just transfers that into the mind. Yep. And so it ultimately will end up in a kind of solipsism, because if I can't know the world beyond my sense data, even if I have all these a priori categories that the mind structures, kind of like a good analogy I heard from a professor was that it's like an ice tray. The mind is like the ice tray, and then the information coming into the senses is like the water that's kind of filters into the little, sections. And so the mind is that tray. Information gets put into its proper category by the mind. The problem, of course, is that this still doesn't get us anywhere in knowing about the external world. Right. And if we're stuck in our own minds, and if Kant's system is the case, then Kant can't actually know that other minds work that way, because he can't know anything about other minds, right? So it's a difficult system because of the fact that it's still an autonomous man system building project, is what I'm trying to say. Right. Yeah. And all of the philosophers basically are secular Promethean system building projects. That's why they all fail. It doesn't mean they don't have insights, but the ultimate goal that they're trying to do, I will build the system that will, like, what's this joke that was going around in 2016, right? Trump will complete the system of German idealism, right? I mean, it was a joke about Trump, but it was expressing the idea of the German idealist to create the perfectly rational grand system, which is just ridiculous and stupid, right? Doesn't mean there's not insights. I mean, even in Hegel, for example, there's a lot of transcendental kind of argumentation. Right. Doesn't mean he's a transcendental proponent of God. He's not arguing for the transcendental argument for God, but he will use transcendental arguments in a lot of the places in his system. Yeah. In the phenomenology of spirit, for example. But
so maybe it's useful then to point out right there that the Renaissance and this humanism. So as we're talking about what is happening that is focusing on this autonomous system building, at a deeper level. And I would argue that you look at the Enlightenment, you look at the humanism, the rise of humanism, the Renaissance, then you look at the Enlightenment and the focus on reason itself, that there is this philosophical concept that somehow we can just use this pure rationality and we can come to more and more certitude, when really, as we're talking about, it moves in the opposite process.
Well, again, there's a good writer on the history of culture and philosophy, Louis Dupre, and he has a book called The Hermeneutics of Modernity. And in that book, he points out that Descartes' revolution in terms of epistemology shifts all of the ancient world and medieval world into thinking no longer about metaphysics, but about man's individual mind. So basically, the new starting point is not the metaphysics that's out there or God or whatever. It's now this. And when you start with this and empirical sense data, you have a huge order. You've got a lot to do. And this is why it's so easy to do apologetics in terms of modern atheism and empiricism, is because they've really locked themselves into a stupid system, because they assume that the sufficiency of the human mind to basically do this giant system building project, and it can't even get off the ground because they're not going to be able to answer fundamental questions that I know, for example, as an apologist or student of philosophy, from these philosophers. Right. So if you're going to do this big project, I don't care who you are, whether you're a Dawkins or a Dennett or a whoever, whatever kind of guy you are, atheist philosopher on Reddit or whatever, you're going to have to answer and deal with these problems. And all I have to do is just repeat the questions that these philosophers raise. For example, Kant's system will divorce the mind from the world in itself.
Right.
So what we know is the appearances. We don't know the things in themselves, right? The Ding an sich, the noumena. We know the phenomena.
Right.
And if that's the case, later philosophers build on that to point out that, well, wait a minute, we don't actually know that the information coming in to the senses is telling us something about something out there that is accurate.
Right.
Right.
We don't.
That's an assumption.
Right.
I mean, maybe it is, but how do we justify that? In other words, I'll read a quote from philosopher Richard Rorty. Rorty says, "Since truth is a property of sentences, and since sentences are dependent for their existence upon vocabularies, and since vocabularies are made by human beings, it would seem to follow then that truths are then made by human beings." So while you're sitting here, not you, but the person rambling about what they think exists out there in the world, if I know Kant and I know this linguistic philosophy question from Rorty, I can just simply point out that, like, what are you even talking about? You have no justification to know that, number one, the words and the vocabulary sentences that you're saying have meaning, or that they match up to anything that's going on in the external world, because until you solve the dilemmas of Hume and Kant, your mind is divorced from the external world.
Right. Yeah. So continue.
So the point is just that, like, the questions are so insurmountable and difficult when you have these foolish starting points and presuppositions of unbelieving thought, that the systems, I should make it even stronger. It's not that they don't get off the ground. They contradict themselves at such a fundamental level that they make knowledge impossible.
Right. And so, building on what you just said, we have Hume, we have Kant, and then the two schools that really then move forward from there is, empiricism, and really just a larger description is phenomenology, whether it be German idealism or romanticism, American transcendentalism. The new epistemology is now phenomenology. We're going to study the phenomena of sense experience, because really the only thing, if Kant was right for the German ideal, if Kant was right, well, then the only thing we actually know is our sort of conscious reality. And therefore, we can learn the ultimate source of reality. You can look at Hegel's Geist in the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is this grand understanding of history, then moving to this precipice, this ultimate synthesis of the world spirit, of my spirit, Jay's spirit. Jay's the antithesis to my thesis. And so we're working things out through a synthesis, and the whole world is going through this experiential process. And so it's a new understanding of how we come to knowledge. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have the Locke's, the John Stuart Mills of the world, the Auguste Comtes, where they're going to focus more on the hypothetico-deductive model of how we get to truth. And so let's just tackle then those two approaches, because now epistemology, basically after Kant breaks down, we either have the hypothetico-deductive scientific method, or we have the phenomenological method where we just study phenomenal experience, and really my own personal consciousness is the only way that I can extrapolate to universals.
Right. Well, these schools also tend to collapse and not work. And so for example, in phenomenology with Husserl, you have an attempt to engage in these really sort of inane and abstract ways of bracketing one's experience to break them apart and figure out what are the necessary elements of any phenomenal experience. And while you could see that kind of as an extension of some of what Kant talked about, all of these exercises are still kind of futile. I mean, in the case of bracketing and whatnot, later philosophers will ask and raise problems that not only apply to any foundationalist, but would apply to something like the bracketing process. For example, bracketing assumes that I can achieve neutrality, that I can achieve an epistemically privileged position such that I am not influenced by any of my past experience.
Right.
And this is really a philosopher's pipe dream. I mean, how does anybody, I mean, it just assumes brute factuality, right? That what Sellers will call the myth of the given, that objects just have a givenness to them, that and that there's a direct correspondence between the properties of the objects and the sense data that comes into my mind, again, which is an unjustified move. We don't actually know that that's the case. There's a great quote by philosopher Imre Lakatos, pretty well known, but the quote is, "One can today easily demonstrate that there's been no valid derivation of a law of nature from any finite number of facts. Yet we still keep reading about scientific theories being proven from facts. Why is there this stubborn resistance to elementary logic?" And he's just repeating Hume, right? And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about arguments from Descartes or from Locke or all the way up to phenomenologists. Even if we just restrict these things to phenomena of the mind, and we don't care about the external world, again, this leads us to positions of solipsism.
Yep.
If I'm locked in my own mind, then I mean, there's all kinds of things that I don't actually know are the case. And I don't even know what it means to be a mind, or what it means to, when I start to investigate linguistic philosophy, I mean, if meaning is something that's purely human determined, then what good does it say? Is it to say that meaning is a self-referencing structure that my mind has made up? That's what you would have to say. Because again, you don't get information or meaning from the external world that we know of. All we know of is what's imprinted on the mental data that's imprinted from the external world.
Right.
Which again, we don't know that it actually is telling us anything correctly.
Right.
And that will actually be questions that Locke will raise. Locke will raise questions about what are called primary and secondary qualities of objects. And later philosophers simply just collapse these and say, I mean, that's kind of what Kant's doing. I mean, it's like, on what basis do you think that there's an underlying primary substance or essence of a thing if all you have access to is the external phenomenal qualities or properties, or the accidents of a thing, to use Aristotle's term?
Right.
In other words, the belief in the cutting off of metaphysics that Hume and Kant do is very devastating, and it's like it takes centuries for people really to figure out how devastating it is. That's why Lakatos can say centuries later that we still are not answering Hume's problems. And there's another famous paper that I always get mixed up with Quine. It's Nelson Goodman's New Riddle of Induction. And in that famous philosophy paper, and Goodman points out that we still haven't answered Hume. I mean, the problem of induction is still there. That's what Lakatos is pointing out, which is that we don't have actually a valid basis on empirical starting points to believe in laws of anything. So if we don't have laws of nature, how are we going to do science? So Husserl, for example, one of the things he set out to do in the logical investigations was to try to rescue science. He wanted to rescue the logic and math assumed in science. And again, as presuppositionalists, we can actually appreciate this.
Right.
Because one thing that Husserl does is kind of, as a mathematician, he goes through and he looks at how science operates, and he's like, the scientists don't even see how much math and logic they're assuming to do the scientific method.
Right.
Now, that doesn't make Husserl a presuppositionalist, right? But the logical investigations is just a very boring technical 2-volume work demonstrating that over and over and over, really just demolishing this scientism, this positivism, and this pragmatism that you're talking about.
Right.
And so he again attempts to kind of resurrect some of these ancient medieval and metaphysical ideas from his mentor, Franz Brentano. Brentano, for example, wanted to resurrect this idea of the medieval philosophers of intentionality. Yes. That we direct in the process of knowing, we direct our intention to some intentional object, and then that leads to the phenomenal experiences.
Right.
And then we can dissect the phenomena of experience by breaking it down into the different aspects of that phenomena. Right. So now these attempts, which again, they're interesting in that they have some insights and that they point out things that you might not know about or are there in an object. For example, this kind of brings up the question of what's called mereology, mereology. And many of the phenomenologists had some pretty fascinating insights into the question of parts and wholes when it comes to objects. So I'm just giving this as an example of why not everything in these schools of philosophy is bad or stupid. They have some insights, just like Kant, right? Like